joining this session this afternoon. I'm Sarah Knight. I'm Head of Learning and Teaching, Learning and Teaching Transformation at Jisc, and really delighted to be sharing with you today some of our latest research around assessment and feedback, and more importantly, how we think about redesigning assessment and feedback for a digital age. So some of you may remember that we have been working in this space for many years. I've put up a slide there which shows sort of a potted history of some of the work and the previous research that we have done since 2011 in this space. Through that work, we had some excellent work that went on around assessment life cycle, and that's a model that Manchester Metropolitan University developed and worked with us on that's still highly referenced. We did a review of the electronic management of assessment landscape, and we produced various different guidance materials. But that was then. And in February 2020, that sort of key date just before lockdown struck, we published a new report looking at the future of assessment. That sort of articulated a vision for assessment and feedback, and for assessments to be authentic, accessible, appropriately automated, continuous and secure. So some quite high aspirations, which then the pandemic hit, and of course we know everything changed. A real emphasis and focus on how do we assess our students digitally. The two following reports there, Assessment Rebooted and Rethinking Assessment, developed in collaboration with Emerge Education, then documented the challenges that higher education were experiencing in taking forward assessment in a very different world. So we're now emerging from that, and at the end of 2021, we thought it was appropriate to stop and reflect and see what's changed. We know that there's many universities, both in the UK but also internationally, that were rethinking their assessment practice. We did some work where we developed some principles for assessment and feedback previously. We wanted to revisit those. We wanted to understand whether that assessment life cycle was still valid, but also to sort of identify areas of innovation. And hence we embarked on some research that was going to give us a way forward and look at the current landscape in higher education in the UK. Now, I'd like you to think about your context and think about the challenges that you may be facing with your assessment and feedback practice. If you have got a phone with you or a device with you and you'd like to enter some of your challenges, please do. We've got menti.com and a code there which you'll be able to enter to share some of your challenges in relation to assessment and feedback. I'll give you a moment or two just to take a photograph and to scan the QR code if you'd like to participate. And I will share the findings of that. I'll tweet them out afterwards and you can see. But when we did that before, and some previous sessions that we've been running, this is a word cloud that came back. And you'll see there that there's some words there that are quite striking in relation to some of the challenges that are being experienced. Consistency of experience is one that comes through quite strongly. Workload. And I think certainly the workload that we've been seeing has ever been increasing for our staff in relation to teaching online, in relation to assessing online. You'll see there that authenticity, feedback, communication, cheating, standardization, engagement, some keywords there that may reflect the challenges that you're seeing within your areas of work too. So, yes, I think it's fair to say that at the moment the sector is experiencing challenges in this space. So what did we find and what did we discover with the research that we did? So towards the end of 2021, we carried out a survey within higher education, and we asked questions around challenge areas. We wanted to get a better understanding around the digital tools that were supporting assessment and feedback, And we also wanted to revisit some of the previous work we did back in 2014 and seeing where that shift and changes had come in. So we had a total of 63 responses from 46 higher education institutions. And you'll see there a link through to our assessment report, which gives more details on these findings. But I'd like to share with you a few key highlights that are coming through from that research and some of the headlines and what has changed. So if we look at our first area of online submissions, most institutions now have implemented online submission of student work. And it's not surprising to see that this is the most frequent use of technology. In 2014, just under 30% had already made online submissions mandatory institution-wide. And now that figure stands at 54%, with a further 44% saying it's widely used. So perhaps that's to be expected. But moving on to online marking. In 2021, 31% of respondents said online marking is institutionally mandated, and a further 54% said it's widely used. So the figure for widespread usage is almost double what it was 7 years ago. And this seems to present a significant change in attitude. In 2014, not only was online marking relatively little used, but it was also one of the biggest areas of resistance to the introduction of digital technology to support assessment and feedback processes. But there is a challenge, and when we look at digital tools to be able to support feedback, we're seeing an increase in the use of digital tools, and that's a welcome development based on, given that our previous research found effective engagement with feedback was really key to enhancing the learning experience. Previously, 58% of respondents were making fairly widespread use of technology to support this process, and this has increased to 91% in 2021. But what is equally evident is that many approaches that we have known for some time to be pedagogically effective, for example, peer review and group work, still remain least well supported by digital tools in UK higher education. That's not particularly surprising, as our past research found that many of these approaches were not well supported by the core tools and innovative developments that proved difficult to scale up. So when we looked at the sector challenges, we had some really interesting responses. In 2014, we didn't ask the same questions as what we asked in our 2021 survey, but we did ask for the areas or the pain points that universities were experiencing in relation to assessment and feedback. In 2014, just over 6% of respondents identified accessibility and inclusivity as a significant issue. And when we asked similar questions this year, our responses back for the pedagogical challenges came back as 51% identified accessibility and inclusivity as a key challenge area. Now, I think we can relate this back to the fact that for the legal compliance, there is a far more raised awareness around making our assessments accessible and inclusive. And I will come back to that theme when I talk about our principles shortly. The second key challenge relates to supporting staff to rethink their assessment practice. And I know many universities now are in the situation where they are working with staff to think about how they can design their assessments differently, to integrate that into course and curriculum design more effectively, and not to be thinking of it solely as an end point. Academic integrity always comes up as a challenge in every conversation we have with staff. And we know that there's significant concerns around how we stop students cheating in a digital world. There's also a real emphasis of that, I think, in the media as well. And there's a fairly widespread assumption that perhaps it's easier to cheat in the digital world than it necessarily was before. But perhaps not stopping to address the fundamental questions around why students may be cheating in the first place. From our sector consultation, which formed part of this review, underlying issues included over-assessment and assessment bunching, causing students to panic, not paying sufficient regard to students' personal circumstances and the stresses they may be facing, and students not really understanding the principles of academic integrity and how that relates to the ethical practices in the world of work. So if we could perhaps tackle these areas, coupled with designing assessments that don't readily lend themselves to tailor-made answers, perhaps we'll go further in addressing this issue. However, staff don't just want digital tools. They want digital tools that work well together. And we know now in universities there is a plethora of digital systems and tools that staff are having to navigate round. Educators want the flexibility to create an ecosystem that works for their students. A surprising 83% of respondents reported interoperability as one of the key technical challenges that they are facing. And this figure appears really higher than what it ought to be, given there are well-established open standards that exist. Staff resistance to change, perhaps not just relates to assessment, but I think relates to the wider digital agenda, came through as one of the key cultural challenges that we're facing. And I think if we are talking about digital transformation, our CEO of Jisc this morning gave a presentation around her views around what some of the key blockers are around digital transformation and change. And it's not just staff resistance to change, it's also creating an environment where staff can really thrive, where they can develop their practice, where they have time to innovate and be creative, and where their practice is recognised. So we know that that is an area that needs a huge investment in, along obviously with the underpinning technical infrastructure. And of course that sort of second issue there in relating to feedback and students not engaging with feedback is again a common theme that's running through. But it goes back to that effective design of assessments. It goes back to students really understanding the purpose of assessment. It is also linking that through to employability and not seeing assessment as purely that driver to tick that box, to move through that system, to get on to the next level. It's thinking about that wider sort of lifelong learning agenda as well. So we then, from our challenge areas and from consultation with the sector, revisited our principles for assessment and feedback. We had created those principles a number of years ago in our previous research, and we felt it was time to take what we were learning through our survey, from the review of the literature, and also through the consultation we were doing, and to really rethink our assessment practice. Educational principles to see what had changed and to assess whether they remained a useful foundation for changing assessment practice. Principles are a way of rethinking assessment practice. They can help articulate a vision. They can around the overall purpose of assessment and feedback. And they also provide a synthesis of research into good assessment and feedback practice, saving time for busy academics. They provide a common language for us to use, and they really often written in a succinct and actionable language. So they provide a useful framework for selecting and applying technologies and evaluating their values. So you can find out more about our principle-based approach in our new guide that I will mention shortly, and how you might be able to use those and apply them to support your own assessment and feedback practice. Some of you may be also familiar with the REAP Principles project that was funded by Jisc at the University of Strathclyde and involved Professor David Nichol. And those principles are often frequently quoted and still used. So we felt that it was important for us to revisit the principles, look at how pedagogy and practice is changing. And the original version of our principles didn't perhaps reflect some of the challenge areas that I've been mentioning, like accessibility and the talk of personalisation. Authentic assessment is frequently noted and as an aspiration for effective assessment practice. But this doesn't only apply in what we might have traditionally thought of vocational subjects. The kind of things that we are actually testing in formats such as closed book exams, which rely heavily on recall, fit equally poorly with the working practices of academics or researchers of the future. So, in terms of looking at our direction of travel around assessment and feedback, some of our previous work was very much focused on moving away from assessment of learning to what we termed assessment for learning. Crucial to this was the understanding of the part that feedback plays in helping students monitor and regulate their own learning, and trying to ensure that any feedback activity was actually feeding forward and leading to future improvement. Much of the emphasis that we're seeing now on what we term assessment as learning, the very act of undertaking assessment and feedback activities, is an essential part of the learning process. So this model sums up our current thinking, which all these facets of assessment still need to happen and work well together, but we're thinking differently about the relationship between them. So from consultation with the sector, the survey and the literature review, I'd like to share with you our sort of principles of good learning, teaching and assessment. I've already mentioned the emphasis around accessibility and inclusivity when we're talking about meeting personal needs. But we also need to know that any learner, regardless of where they are learning and whether or not they have a disability, is able to engage with a task. But we also need to think about inclusivity in terms of format and choice of topic. So inclusivity also means that no one's social and economic background should be a barrier to learning. A term we've used increasingly as part of the academic is compassionate pedagogy. As we've zoomed in and out of each other's homes, teachers have gained a different kind of understanding around the conditions under which students are working and staff are delivering learning. That the demands of work and family they have to juggle and other responsibilities are very much factored into how our students are learning today. Digital poverty is only one aspect of this. Time pressures and access to a suitable place of study make it equally relevant and need to be factored into the way in which we design our learning and assessment. So we're developing a better understanding of how and why things work. A good example here is the ongoing work by Professor David Nicol at the University of Glasgow. His earlier work was grounded in helping learners develop the capacity to self-regulate, and we could see that self and peer review were important aspects of this. His current thinking is evolving to show that making comparisons with other work, with learning resources, is the fundamental way in which students generate inner feedback and improve their own learning. Our principles have gone one step further than talking about dialogue around learning to really foreground the idea of developing autonomous learners and viewing students as partners in the learning community. More and more examples of practice that we're seeing from across higher education is where students and staff and employers are all working in partnership to really drive forward the innovation agenda. We've also added in employability into the vision of the principles, and we are in no way suggesting that workforce development is the main purpose of higher education. But if universities are to remain current in a changing world, then the value of the types of learning we undertake and what happens afterwards need to be made clear. So I'd frame the current debate around academic misconduct and plagiarism in the context of this as well. So I've created a Google Doc that links through to those examples and those principles of practice, which you can access through that bit.ly link there. There is also a QR code which you're able to scan, and that will take you through to the principles. And I'd be very interested in gathering your comments in relation to those principles and how they might relate to principles that you might be working to. Comments around how we might be able to implement those in practice, what support needs to be there to enable staff to realise those aspirations. And hopefully that will be a useful tool for you to think about how you might engage discussions with staff and students in your organisation. I'll just give you a few minutes to access that QR code and that bit.ly link. And you're able to go into more depth around those principles within our new guide. You have a link there to the guide that's on our website. And for each of those 7 principles, we go through and discuss the context and the background relating to each one of those principles. We also look at the role technology can play in supporting assessment and feedback practice, but very much from a pedagogical point of view. And then we've illustrated that with examples of practice around assessment and feedback that are coming through from practice across the UK, but also internationally. And there's some really excellent examples in that guide, which really show the breadth and the wealth of knowledge that's being developed around this space and the role technology is playing within that. We've also launched our Beyond the Technology podcast on assessment. So on the Jisc site, if you look at put in podcasts, you'll come up with our Beyond the Technology show. And we've launched a mini-series around assessment and feedback. So our first one went live this week, and we have another 5 series of that planned with some experts from around the UK talking about how they are changing assessment and feedback within their universities. So do encourage you to listen to that. So I'm going to end there. I'm going to hopefully have some questions that will be coming up using the Slido link, but we also have a roving mic. So if anyone would like to pose a question or add any comments, I would encourage you to do so. And also continue adding your thoughts and reflections into the Google Doc as well. So thank you.